Today, we're diving into something that affects more people than you might realize. Why so many intellectually gifted individuals end up feeling like prisoners in their own minds, watching life happen to everyone else while they remain mysteriously stuck behind invisible walls. If you've ever wondered why being smart sometimes feels more like a curse than a blessing, if you felt that strange combination of superiority and isolation that makes no logical sense, this conversation might change how you see your entire life story. This dilemma starts with you when you were the kid everyone called brilliant. Teachers would light up when you walked into class. Parents would beam with pride at dinner parties when your name came up. Other kids would automatically look to you during group work, expecting you to have the answers. You sailed through challenges that left your peers drowning in confusion. You were supposed to have it made, right? You were the one everyone predicted would go places, achieve great things, leave everyone else in the dust. Fast forward to today, and instead of feeling like you're ahead of the pack, you might feel like you're watching life through a window, seeing connection, fulfillment, and genuine joy happening to other people while you remain inexplicably on the outside. You're still sharp, still capable, still the person others come to when they need something figured out. But inside, there's this gnawing sense that something fundamental is broken. And you can't even explain what it is because on paper, everything looks fine. If this resonates with you, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't a character flaw, and it's not a failure on your part. What I'm about to share with you is the predictable result of a specific type of psychological development that happens to intellectually gifted children. And here's what's remarkable. The solution to this modern psychological dilemma was actually demonstrated 2,000 years ago by someone who understood human nature at a level that makes our contemporary psychology textbooks look like rough drafts. But before we can grasp that solution, we need to understand exactly how this invisible prison gets constructed around us. Because the walls are built so gradually and so cleverly that most people trapped inside them can't even see what is holding them captive. Let's begin with something that seems innocent enough: how a child's sense of identity forms. When we're young, our understanding of who we are is beautifully simple and refreshingly one-dimensional. A 5-year-old will tell you with absolute confidence that they're the one who loves dinosaurs, or the fast runner, or the one who makes people laugh. They don't carry the burden of complex, multifaceted identities yet. They latch onto one or two defining characteristics and build their entire sense of self around them like a house built on a single foundation stone. This simplicity is completely normal and healthy. Identity has to start somewhere, and it starts with these basic building blocks. But here's what becomes absolutely crucial, and what most parents and teachers never realize. Which trait becomes that foundation stone will determine the entire architecture of a person's life. Because whatever becomes your core identity will unconsciously shape every decision you make, every risk you're willing to take, every relationship you're able to form, and every opportunity you'll either embrace or avoid. Now, if you were identified early as the smart one, that became your primary foundation stone. And what an intoxicating foundation it was. Think back to what happened in your body, in your nervous system, every time someone recognized your intelligence. Your teacher's face would brighten when you raised your hand, and you'd feel that warm rush of validation flooding through your chest. Your parents would practically glow with pride when report cards came home. And you'd experience that addictive feeling of being special, of mattering, of being seen. Other kids would turn to you during group work with a mixture of respect and dependence that made you feel important in a way that nothing else could match. For a while, this identity served you perfectly. You were living life on what felt like easy mode while everyone around you seemed to be struggling through some harder version of the game. While other kids wrestled with concepts that confused them, you picked up ideas immediately, almost effortlessly. While others needed hours of study to understand what was happening, you could glance at material and somehow just get it. While others felt lost and overwhelmed by academic challenges, you felt confident, capable, and consistently ahead of the curve. The praise kept coming, and your brain started making neural connections that would later prove devastating. Every time you succeeded without effort, you got that hit of validation. Every time you understood something quickly, you received confirmation that you were special. Every time you performed well without trying hard, the adults around you lit up with delight and told you how gifted you were. But here's where the trap begins to form, and it's so subtle that nobody, not you, not your parents, not your teachers, not even the well-meaning adults who were trying to encourage you, realizes what's happening. When people praised you for being smart, they weren't actually praising effort, perseverance, curiosity, or hard work. They were praising effortless success. They were celebrating the fact that you didn't have to struggle like everyone else. Your developing brain, which is designed to learn patterns and create survival strategies, started making a connection that would eventually become toxic. If I'm smart, things should be easy for me. This belief gets reinforced over and over again through countless small interactions. Easy success equals proof of intelligence. Immediate understanding equals confirmation of your special status. Effortless performance equals validation of your worth as a person. Your nervous system literally begins to wire itself around this equation. On a neurological level, your brain starts treating struggle not as a normal part of learning, but as a threat to your identity. The same fight-or-flight response that's designed to keep you safe from physical danger begins to activate whenever you encounter intellectual difficulty. This creates what I call the effortless success trap, and it's one of the most psychologically destructive patterns a human being can develop. Because here's what happens when this wiring is in place. The moment something isn't easy, when you struggle, when you don't immediately grasp a concept, when you have to work hard to understand something, it doesn't feel like a normal learning experience anymore. It feels like an emergency. Your internal alarm system starts screaming, "Wait, if I'm supposed to be smart, why is this hard? If things should be easy for me, what does it mean that I'm struggling? Maybe I'm not actually smart after all. Maybe everyone was wrong about me. Maybe I've been fooling myself and everyone else this whole time." The fear that floods through your system isn't just about failing at a task. It's about the potential collapse of your entire identity. Because if you're not smart, then who are you? If you're not special, then what makes you worth loving? If you're not effortlessly gifted, then what's your value in this world? This terror is so overwhelming that your mind immediately starts looking for ways to avoid ever feeling it again. And the solution your brain comes up with seems perfectly logical. Avoid anything that might trigger the struggle that threatens your identity. So you start making choices to protect yourself, small choices at first, but they compound and multiply over time like interest on a debt you didn't know you were accumulating. You stop raising your hand unless you're absolutely certain of the answer, because the possibility of being wrong feels like a threat to your survival. You avoid classes that look too challenging, telling yourself you're just not interested in those subjects. You won't try new activities unless you're confident you'll excel immediately, because being a beginner feels too dangerous to your sense of self. You begin carefully, unconsciously editing your life to only include experiences that reinforce your image as someone who's naturally gifted. You start living in what becomes an increasingly narrow comfort zone, but you don't realize it's narrowing because the walls move in so gradually. Meanwhile, your world starts to shrink in ways that seem invisible from the inside. While everyone else is out there experimenting, taking risks, trying new things, failing spectacularly, picking themselves up and trying again, you're trapped behind the walls of your own psychological protection system. You're not growing anymore. You're just maintaining an image. And here's the cruel irony that makes this trap so insidious. The very thing you're trying to protect, your reputation for being intelligent, your identity as someone who's gifted, actually requires you to stop learning and growing. Because real learning involves struggle. Real growth happens at the uncomfortable edge of your current abilities. Real intelligence develops through making mistakes, getting confused, working through problems you don't immediately understand, and gradually building competence through effort and persistence. But you can't afford any of that anymore because your entire sense of worth depends on maintaining the illusion that everything comes easily to you. You've become a prisoner of your own specialness. This is exactly the kind of psychological prison that Jesus understood and spoke about when he told the parable of the talents. Remember the servant who was given 1 talent and buried it in the ground because he was afraid of losing it? That servant represents everyone who becomes so afraid of failure that they stop trying altogether. Jesus understood that when you're more focused on protecting what you have than on growing into what you could become, you end up losing even what you started with. Jesus himself demonstrated a completely different approach to intelligence and learning throughout the Gospels. Even though he was divine, the scriptures tell us he grew in wisdom and stature. He learned. He asked questions, not rhetorical questions designed to make others think, but genuine questions because he wanted to understand people's experiences. He wasn't afraid to admit when something required effort or when he needed to process information more deeply. When he was 12 years old and his parents found him in the temple talking with the teachers, he wasn't showing off his knowledge. He was listening to them and asking them questions. Even as the Son of God, he modeled that real wisdom comes through curiosity and engagement, not through protecting an image of effortless perfection. But by the time you're caught in the effortless success trap, this kind of vulnerable learning feels impossible. All you know is that you feel like a fraud who might be exposed at any moment. So you become increasingly careful about which challenges you will accept and which situations you'll allow yourself to enter. This is where the isolation begins. And this part is particularly heartbreaking because it happens so gradually that you don't realize what you're losing until you wake up one day feeling completely disconnected from everyone around you. Here's something most people don't understand about how real connection actually forms. It doesn't happen when people are performing at their best or showcasing their talents. Deep, lasting relationships are built when people are struggling together, learning together, being vulnerable together, supporting each other through challenges that none of them have mastered yet. Think about the friendships you've observed that seem most genuine and resilient. They're not built around mutual admiration for each other's achievements. They're forged in moments when people are figuring things out together, when they're all terrible at the new skill they're trying to learn, when they're all going through the same difficult transition, when they're supporting each other through challenges that leave everyone feeling uncertain and human. Connection forms through what psychologists call shared struggle. When you're all equally confused in the same challenging class, when you're all equally awkward learning a new sport, when you're all equally nervous about a life transition you're facing, those shared experiences of vulnerability and mutual support create the foundation for relationships that can last a lifetime. But you're systematically removing yourself from every situation where this kind of bonding could happen. You won't join clubs or activities because you might not be immediately good at them. You avoid group projects because they might reveal that you don't know everything. You skip social activities that involve learning new skills because you can't bear the thought of being a beginner in front of other people. You turn down invitations to try new things because the risk of looking foolish feels too dangerous. Without realizing it, you're stepping out of the natural flow of human social development. While everyone else is connecting through shared struggles and mutual growth, you're standing on the sidelines, watching it happen from behind the protective walls of your intellectual superiority, telling yourself you're just not interested in those kinds of superficial activities. But you still crave connection. You're human, and the need for belonging is wired into your nervous system just like everyone else's. So what do? You fall back on the only tool you trust, the only skill you're confident won't betray you, your intelligence. Instead of relating to people naturally and emotionally, you start analyzing them intellectually. You begin observing social dynamics like a researcher studying a foreign culture, taking mental notes on how these strange creatures called normal people interact with each other. You run complex calculations in your head about what to say, how to respond, what they might be thinking about you, what impression you're making. You try to understand people rather than actually connecting with them. You attempt to solve the puzzle of human relationship through analysis rather than experiencing it through presence. This creates what psychologists call cognitive empathy versus emotional empathy. You become incredibly skilled at reading people, at predicting their reactions, at saying the right things in conversations. You can understand what others are feeling on an intellectual level. You can analyze their motivations. You can even manipulate their responses if you choose to. But you're not actually emotionally engaged with them. You're performing rather than being present. You're calculating rather than feeling. You're managing the interaction rather than experiencing it. From the outside, this might actually look like social success. You can navigate conversations smoothly because you've studied the patterns. You might even seem charismatic or sophisticated because you're so good at reading people and responding appropriately. People might enjoy talking with you because you seem so perceptive and articulate. But inside, you're completely exhausted. Because instead of just being with people, you're working constantly. Instead of relaxing into natural interaction, you're doing mental gymnastics to maintain your image and avoid exposure. Every conversation becomes a performance where you're simultaneously the actor, the director, and the critic, watching yourself to make sure you don't slip up and reveal that you don't actually know how to just be human with other humans. Socializing becomes another area where you feel pressure to be perfect. Another arena where you might fail and threaten the identity you've built your entire life around. So gradually, almost imperceptibly, you start avoiding social situations too. You decline invitations because you're tired of the constant calculation required. You spend more time alone, telling yourself you prefer it that way, that other people are too draining, that you're just more of an introvert than you realized. But the loneliness deepens, settling into your bones like a chronic ache that you learn to live with but never quite forget. And because you're intelligent, because that's your thing, your identity, your supposed superpower, you think you should be able to solve this problem. You should be able to figure out why you feel so disconnected when you seem so socially skilled. You should be able to analyze why relationships feel so difficult when you understand people so well intellectually. You should be able to think your way into the connection and belonging that seem to come naturally to everyone else. So you do what smart people do when they encounter a problem. You apply logic to it. You analyze your own behavior to death, picking apart every social interaction, every awkward moment, every feeling of disconnection, until you're completely paralyzed by self-awareness. You read articles about social skills and emotional intelligence, trying to implement techniques for better relationships like you're debugging a computer program. You write out rational arguments for why you should feel more confident or more connected, crafting elaborate internal essays to convince yourself that you're fine, that everything is under control, that you just need to think about this differently. You attempt to think your way into emotional wellness like it's a math problem you just haven't solved yet. But here's the fundamental issue that creates an endless, exhausting loop. Intelligence was never designed to generate self-worth or cure emotional pain. Your mind is a brilliant tool for solving external problems, but it's completely inadequate for healing internal wounds. When you try to use your intellect to feel okay inside yourself, it's like trying to use a calculator to write poetry. You're using the wrong tool for the job. The question that haunts you, am I enough? Am I worthy of love and connection? Cannot be answered through analysis. It can't be resolved through logical arguments or rational thinking. It can only be answered relationally, through experiencing unconditional acceptance from others. It can only be healed through connection that doesn't depend on your performance or your intellectual capabilities. And here's the tragic irony. While you've been developing your intellectual abilities to extraordinary levels, emotional growth, the very thing you need most, often becomes the one area that gets completely left behind. You might be brilliant at analyzing complex problems, but you're functioning with the emotional intelligence of someone much younger because you've spent years avoiding the very experiences that develop emotional maturity. But you've structured your entire life to avoid the vulnerability that this kind of connection requires. You've built walls so high and so sophisticated that even you don't realize they're there. This is where Jesus' understanding of human nature becomes profoundly healing. When people came to him with emotional pain, with questions about their worth, with deep loneliness and disconnection, he never gave them intellectual frameworks to think their way out of it. He offered presence, he offered acceptance, he offered relationship. Look at how he interacted with Nicodemus, one of the smartest, most educated religious leaders of his time. Nicodemus came to Jesus at night, probably because he was afraid of what other people might think if they saw him seeking help. He approached Jesus intellectually, trying to understand the concepts Jesus was teaching. But Jesus didn't engage on that level. Instead, he spoke to Nicodemus about being born again, about becoming like a child, about letting go of everything he thought he knew and starting over. Jesus understood that Nicodemus's real problem wasn't intellectual. It was spiritual and emotional. He needed to experience God's love, not understand it. He needed to be transformed by relationship, not informed by theology. When the emotional pain becomes too sharp, when the loneliness starts feeling truly unbearable, that's when your ego deploys its final and most insidious defense mechanism. And this one is particularly dangerous because it feels like insight and wisdom when it's actually the deepest form of self-deception. You start telling yourself a story that feels sophisticated and self-aware. I'm just different from other people. I don't connect because they're not operating on my intellectual level. I'm too deep for surface-level friendships. I'm too sophisticated for most social situations. I think about things that other people don't even consider. I see patterns and possibilities that escape most minds. This narrative feels like enlightenment. It feels like you've finally figured out why you've always felt different. You're not struggling to connect. You're choosing not to engage with people beneath your level. You're not excluded. You're exclusive. You're not lonely. You're selective. This story protects your ego from the devastating admission that your entire strategy for living isn't working. It's less painful to believe you're too good for the connections you're missing than to acknowledge how desperately you want them and how terrified you are that you might not be worthy of them. But this defensive arrogance becomes the final wall between you and everyone else. It's the ultimate prison cell. Because even when part of you wants to reach out, wants to be vulnerable, wants to try connecting authentically, this story keeps you locked in isolation. Because if you're really superior to everyone else, then admitting you need them becomes impossible. Jesus encountered this pattern constantly in his interactions with the religious leaders of his time. The Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law. These were the smartest, most educated people in their society, and they had built elaborate systems of superiority that kept them isolated from the very people they were supposed to serve. But Jesus consistently challenged this thinking, and he did it in the most direct way possible, through his example. Here was someone with every reason to consider himself above others, yet he deliberately spent time with people from every social and intellectual level. He ate with tax collectors who were considered traitors. He had deep conversations with fishermen and carpenters who had no formal education. He took children seriously when the culture considered them unimportant. He treated prostitutes and outcasts with dignity when society had written them off. He never positioned himself as too sophisticated for anyone's company. Instead, he demonstrated that real wisdom includes the humility to learn from anyone and the courage to need others. He showed that true intelligence isn't about being above people. It's about being present with them. So how do you break out of this pattern that's been shaping your life since childhood? How do you escape a psychological prison that you've been building around yourself for so long that you can't even see the walls anymore? The path forward requires something that might initially feel terrifying, like psychological death. You have to be willing to let go of identifying as the smart one. And I can already hear the resistance rising in your mind. But what if I really am more intelligent than most people? Isn't this just asking me to dumb myself down? Won't being vulnerable hurt my reputation, my career, my prospects? Let me be clear about what I'm not suggesting. I'm not saying you should hide your gifts or pretend to be less capable than you are. I'm not advocating for false humility or intellectual dishonesty. God gave you intelligence for a reason, and using it well is part of your calling. But what I am suggesting is that basing your entire worth on any single trait, even a positive one like intelligence, creates a fragile, defensive way of living that ultimately destroys the very thing it's trying to protect. When your value is tied to how easily you succeed, you will unconsciously sabotage any opportunity for real growth, real connection, or real fulfillment. You'll choose safety over possibility, image over authenticity, isolation over vulnerability, and you'll do it so automatically that you won't even realize you're making these choices. Jesus modeled a completely different way of existing in the world. His identity wasn't built on his performance, his abilities, his reputation, or even his divine nature as it related to others. It was rooted in his relationship with the Father, in being unconditionally loved, not for what he could do, but for who he was. This unshakable foundation freed him to engage authentically with every situation without needing to protect an image. He could ask questions without feeling stupid because his worth didn't depend on having all the answers. He could admit confusion without losing face because his identity wasn't threatened by not knowing. He could learn from anyone, even from children, even from people society considered unimportant, because his value came from being loved, not from being impressive. This is the shift that changes everything, building your identity not around being smart, but around being willing to grow, not around having answers, but around being curious, not around performing perfectly, but around showing up authentically as yourself. Instead of asking what will make me look intelligent, you start asking what will help me learn and connect and become more fully human. Instead of protecting your image, you start embracing the discomfort that comes with real growth. You let yourself be terrible at new things. You allow yourself to ask obvious questions. You show up not to impress anyone, but simply to participate in the beautiful, messy experience of being human alongside other humans who are also figuring it out as they go. And yes, this feels awkward at first. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it feels like a step backward when you're used to being the one with answers, but it's not a step backward. It's the first real step toward the kind of life you've been wanting but couldn't figure out how to create. Here's a simple practice you can try this week. In your next conversation, instead of trying to say something clever or insightful, ask a genuine question about the other person's experience. Not a question designed to showcase your own knowledge, but a real question because you're genuinely curious about their perspective. Notice what happens in your body when you do this. Notice how the other person responds. Notice how it feels to connect through curiosity rather than through performance. The old identity told you that your value came from being special, from standing out, from being above the ordinary struggles that everyone else faces. The new identity reminds you that your value comes from being human, from being willing to engage with life as it actually is, rather than as you think it should be. And being human means you're allowed to be uncertain. You're allowed to grow slowly. You're allowed to feel lost sometimes. You're allowed to not know what you're doing half the time. You're allowed to need other people, to learn from them, to be changed by them. Jesus celebrated this kind of humanity when he said that unless we become like children, we can't enter the kingdom of heaven. He was pointing to exactly this quality. Children aren't afraid to not know things. They're not embarrassed to ask for help. They don't need to be the smartest person in the room to feel good about themselves. They're naturally curious, naturally vulnerable, naturally willing to try new things even when they're terrible at them. That's the energy Jesus wants us to reclaim. Not childishness, but childlikeness. Not naivety, but genuine curiosity. Not performance, but presence. But what about the practical concerns? What about your career, your relationships, your reputation? Here's what I've observed. People are actually drawn to authenticity far more than they're impressed by performance. When you stop trying to be the smartest person in the room and start being genuinely interested in others, When you stop protecting your image and start being vulnerable about your own struggles and questions, something remarkable happens. People begin to trust you. They start opening up to you in ways they never did when you were performing perfection. They feel safe around you because you're not judging them for not having everything figured out. You're admitting that you do not have everything figured out either. The only way forward is to start taking action from this new identity. Not perfect action, not brilliant action, just honest, imperfect, human action. Jesus' disciples were masters at this approach. Peter constantly said the wrong thing, often with his foot firmly planted in his mouth. Thomas doubted everything, even after seeing miracles with his own eyes. James and John were competitive and ambitious in ways that caused problems for the whole group. None of them had it figured out. But they kept showing up, kept following, kept growing, kept being real with each other about their struggles and failures. And that willingness to engage imperfectly, to be seen in their struggles, to learn through relationship rather than in isolation, that's what allowed them to experience the kind of transformation that didn't just change their own lives, but literally changed the course of human history. If you recognize yourself in what I've been describing, if you've spent years trying to be the smartest person in whatever room you're in, and now you do not know how to be anything else, if you feel trapped behind walls you can't even see but somehow can't break through, this is where your new life begins. You let go of the story that your worth depends on your intellectual performance. You stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be real. You stop protecting an image and start building actual relationships based on genuine connection rather than mutual admiration. Here's another practice. This week, try sharing something you're struggling with or uncertain about with someone you trust. Not a deep, dramatic confession. Just a simple admission that there's something in your life you're trying to figure out. Notice how it feels to be seen in your uncertainty rather than your expertise. You don't need to be the smartest person in any room to belong in it. You just need to be someone who's willing to show up with your questions, with your uncertainties, with your genuine curiosity about others and about life itself. Jesus showed us that the path to connection isn't through superiority, but through vulnerability. Not through having all the answers, but through being willing to explore the questions alongside other people who are also making it up as they go along. When you can finally stop clinging to the version of yourself that needs to be above it all, you'll start to experience something you may not have felt since you were a child. Genuine belonging. Not because you earned it through your intelligence, not because you impressed anyone with your capabilities, but because you were finally willing to step down from the pedestal of specialness and into the beautiful, uncertain, gloriously human experience of figuring out life with other people who love you not for what you know, but for who you are. And here's what Jesus knew that changes everything. That world, the world of ordinary human struggle and growth. And connection isn't something to be afraid of or to consider beneath you. It's not a step down from the isolated pedestal you've been living on. It's actually the only place where you can be truly seen for who you are beyond your achievements. It's the only place where you can experience the kind of love that doesn't depend on your performance. It's the only place where you can finally stop feeling like an outsider looking in through the window and start feeling truly at home. Imagine what your life could look like if you weren't constantly protecting an image. Picture yourself in conversations where you're not calculating what to say, but simply enjoying the person in front of you. Envision joining activities not because you'll excel, but because they seem interesting or fun. Think about the relief of not needing to have an answer to every question, an opinion on every topic, a solution to every problem. This is not about becoming less than you are. It's about becoming more fully who you were always meant to be. The smartest thing you can do is follow the one who chose connection over correctness, love over logic, and relationship over reputation. Because in the end, that's where true wisdom lives. Not in having all the answers, but in being willing to share the questions with others who are walking the same human path, all of us learning to love and be loved just as we are.